It was supposed to be a simple getaway, a weekend in the small town of Hollow Creek. I'd heard about it from a friend who mentioned it had the charm of old-fashioned America, picturesque streets, little shops, and a sense of quiet isolation that I thought would be perfect for a few days of peace and reflection. I never expected it to become a nightmare. When I arrived, I was struck by how eerie the place felt. Hollow Creek wasn't the kind of quaint town you see in travel brochures. It was the kind of place that seemed to be stuck in time. The buildings were old, the streets empty, and the air had a strange stillness to it, like everyone was holding their breath. I checked into a small inn near the town square, the only place with a vacancy, and decided to explore the town the next morning. The locals were friendly enough, though their smiles didn't reach their eyes. They were polite, but always seemed to look over their shoulders as if waiting for something or someone to appear. As I walked through the town, I noticed something odd. There was an old train station at the far edge of town, long abandoned and overgrown with weeds. The track seemed to stretch into nothingness, fading into the forest. I asked a shopkeeper about it, and she quickly changed the subject, giving me a nervous glance before walking away. Later that evening, I had dinner at a local diner. The food was good, but the atmosphere was uncomfortable, like something was off. It wasn't until I overheard a conversation between two elderly men sitting at the counter that things took a darker turn. They say it comes through every few years, one of the men said in a hushed voice, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Yeah, the other man replied, shaking his head. Never on time. But when it does, it's always the same. Nobody sees it coming, but we all hear it. A train that shouldn't be here. I listened intently, but before I could ask them more, they went quiet, looking at each other with a silent understanding, as if they were afraid to speak any further. My curiosity was piqued, but I didn't press them. I had no idea what they were referring to, but the unease in their voices stuck with me. That night, as I was heading back to the inn, I passed the old train station again. The track seemed even darker in the fading light, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. Movement at the far end of the platform. A flicker of light. I quickly dismissed it as my imagination running wild. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it. A distant, low rumble. At first, I thought it was a car passing by, but the sound was too deep, too steady. It grew louder, like the roar of an approaching engine. My heart skipped a beat. I looked down the tracks, but there was nothing in sight. The noise continued to grow, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet, as if something massive was coming. And then, from the shadows, it appeared. A train. It emerged from the darkness at the far end of the platform, the headlights cutting through the night, casting an eerie glow on the tracks. The train was old, too old, its metal gleaming like polished silver with rusted edges and faded paint. There was no sound of wheels on the tracks, just the relentless hum of the engine. The train glided toward me impossibly fast, yet making no noise except for that deep rumbling vibration. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. The train passed right in front of me, its windows black and empty, the doors closed tight. But as it moved past, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the last window, there was a face. A pale face, staring directly at me. It was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his expression hollow and emotionless. He didn't blink, he didn't move, he just stared. And then, as quickly as it had come, the train disappeared into the night, leaving only the sound of my own racing heartbeat behind. I didn't know what to make of it. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, too terrified to move, too confused to think clearly. My mind raced. What was that? Was it real? I didn't hear a whistle, no screeching brakes, just the cold silence of the night that returned when the train was gone. The next morning, I decided to visit the station again, hoping to find some explanation. But when I arrived, the tracks were empty, the platform abandoned. There was no sign of the train, no evidence that it had ever been there. The station was exactly as it had been the day before, decaying, forgotten, and silent. I went into the nearby cafe to grab a coffee and try to shake off the lingering dread from the night before. The same elderly man from the diner was sitting at a table by the window, staring out at the empty street. I took a seat near him, gathering the courage to ask about the train. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked without looking at me. I nodded, my voice shaking. "What is it? What happened last night?" The man sighed deeply, as if weighed down by a lifetime of secrets. He finally looked at me, his eyes clouded with fear. "It's the Hollow Creek train. Every few years it shows up. The people who see it are chosen. But the train doesn't come for no reason. It takes something with it every time it leaves, something important. People go missing after they see it. They vanish without a trace. My blood ran cold. But where does it go? What happens to them? He shook his head. No one knows. No one who's seen it ever remembers clearly. But I know this. If you see the Hollow Creek train, you never leave this town the same. As I left the cafe, the old man's words haunted me. I tried to convince myself it was just a local myth, just a story people told to spook outsiders, but when I got back to the inn, I found something strange. My bags were packed. Someone had gone through my things. I could hear faint footsteps in the hallway, but when I opened the door, there was no one there. The train had left, and something was coming for me. That night, I tried to leave Hollow Creek. I got into my car, but when I turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again, but the car refused to start. The town was eerily quiet. The only thing I could hear was the distant sound of rumbling, like a train moving through the fog. I never saw the train again. I don't know what happened to it, or if it even exists. But I do know one thing. Hollow Creek isn't just a town. It's a place where time doesn't flow the way it should, and where some things, some people are meant to vanish. If you ever find yourself driving through a town called Hollow Creek, don't stop. Don't even look at the tracks. Because once you hear the train, it's already too late. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I never wanted to move to a small town. It was never my dream to live somewhere so quiet, so isolated. But after my parents died, I needed a change. So I packed my bags, sold what little I had left, and drove across the state to a place called Mill Creek. It seemed like a perfect escape, far away from the memories that haunted me. Mill Creek wasn't much. A handful of streets lined with small shops and homes, an old church on the hill, and a field just outside of town. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers stuck out like sore thumbs. I rented a small, rundown house on the edge of town. The house itself wasn't much to look at, but it was affordable, and the land behind it stretched out into that open field. It was peaceful, surrounded by tall grass and a few scattered trees. I thought it would be the perfect place to heal. The silence, the solitude, it was exactly what I needed. But as soon as I moved in, something felt wrong. At night, I would hear noises coming from the field. Not the usual rustling of wind or animals, but something heavier, like footsteps or the sound of something or someone moving through the grass. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe it was a deer or a stray dog. But as the days passed, the noises became more distinct. It was almost like someone was walking in the field. And they were coming close to the house. One evening, after hearing the sound again, I decided to investigate. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the field. But as I walked toward it, a strange unease crept up my spine. I kept my eyes trained on the distant tree line, but all I saw was the rustling of the tall grass in the evening breeze. No footprints, no signs of anything unusual. I tried to shake off the feeling, but I couldn't. There was something out there, something watching me. The next night, the sound was back, louder than before. This time, I decided to sit by the window and watch. The moon was high, casting long shadows across the field. I stared out, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall and thin, moving with an eerie, slow grace through the field. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on my eyes. But as the figure got closer, I could see it clearly. It was a man, but his movements were unnaturally smooth, like he was gliding over the ground. He wore a long, dark coat that seemed out of place for the warm weather, and his face was hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't seem to notice me, or maybe he didn't care. He walked slowly, methodically, straight toward the house. I could see his face now, a pale, featureless mask like a mannequin, smooth and lifeless. The skin was stretched tight over his skull, and his eyes were nothing but dark, hollow voids. Panic surged through me. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure as he continued to walk, never breaking stride. I needed to get out, to leave, but something told me I couldn't look away. I had to know what he was doing. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the figure stopped. He turned his head slowly toward the house, as though he knew I was watching. For a long moment we stood there, locked in an unspoken standoff. I could feel his gaze, even though he had no eyes. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked back into the field, disappearing into the darkness. I couldn't sleep that night. The images of the faceless man, the way he had stood there and stared at me, haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching me from the field. The next day, I told the town's sheriff about what I had seen. He didn't seem surprised. Instead, he gave me a long, hard look and said, "You've met the Watcher." I frowned, not understanding. "The Watcher? That man in the field," he explained. "He's not really a man. He's a thing, something that's been haunting this town for generations. No one knows where he comes from, but he appears every few years, always in the field behind your house. You'll hear him before you see him, walking closer every night. And no one ever talks about it because..." The sheriff paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because the moment you stop seeing him, that's when he starts to watch you from closer. And you never know when you'll see him again." I didn't want to believe him, but as the days went by, the feeling that I was being watched only grew stronger. At night, I kept the blinds closed and the lights on, but I could feel it. Those eyes, invisible but omnipresent, studying me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I couldn't escape the sensation that I was no longer alone in the house. Then, a week later, I woke up to something I could never have prepared myself for. I had fallen asleep with the curtains open, my mind too tired to remember to close them. I woke up in the middle of the night, my body freezing cold, a strange compulsion to look outside. Against my better judgment, I stood and walked toward the window, and there he was, the Watcher, standing in the field, closer than I had ever seen him before. He was right at the edge of the grass, his featureless face staring directly at my window. His empty eyes bore into me, sending a wave of terror through my veins. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I backed away from the window, but the Watcher didn't move. He didn't have to. His presence alone paralyzed me. Then, in the silence of the night, I heard a whisper, a voice, soft but chilling, coming from outside the window. "Come closer." I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I was frozen, unable to tear my gaze away from the Watcher. It felt like hours passed before I could finally pull myself together enough to run, to lock the doors and windows, to hide under the covers, praying he wouldn't come any closer. The next morning, I went to the field, trembling as I walked out the door. The Watcher was gone, but I found something strange, a single large footprint in the dirt right at the base of the house. It was impossibly deep, like something heavy had been standing there, watching me while I slept. I didn't stay in Mill Creek after that. I left the next day. The image of the Watcher burned into my mind. I'm not sure what he was or why he appeared in the field behind my house, but I know one thing for certain. I was lucky to escape. And sometimes when I'm alone, I can still feel his eyes on me, watching from somewhere far away, but always getting closer. Story the end.
Story number 3.
My name is Alex, and I've never been one to believe in ghost stories. At least I didn't until I moved to a small town called Harrow Creek. It was the kind of place where everyone had known each other for decades. The kind of place where you could leave your doors unlocked at night and feel safe. Or so I thought. I didn't expect much when I found the rental. It was a small 2-bedroom house at the edge of town. Quiet, private, and cheap. The landlord, Mrs. Larkin, was an older woman with gray hair and a slow, deliberate way of speaking. She showed me the house, told me the history of the place, and then handed me the keys without asking for much more. It was perfect. I was just happy to get out of the city and into the peace of the country. But looking back now, I should have been more cautious. It started with the noises. I'm not talking about creaking floors or the sound of the wind against the windows. It was something different. The first night I stayed in the house, I heard it. Tapping. Light, quick taps that seemed to come from the walls. I tried to ignore it, blaming it on the house settling, but the sound continued every night. At first, it was faint, but it grew louder each evening until it was impossible to sleep through. It wasn't long before I started noticing strange things around the house. My front door would sometimes be slightly open when I was sure I had closed it. The lights would flicker in a way that didn't make sense, and I would find small objects like coins or buttons lying in the middle of the floor as though someone had placed them there while I wasn't looking. But the worst part came when I started hearing voices. Soft whispers at first, like distant murmurs from just beyond the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Urgent, pleading. It was as if someone was trying to communicate with me. I would try to ignore it, but it grew harder to do so every night. Then one evening, as I sat on my couch trying to watch TV, I saw it. A figure standing outside my window. I froze, staring at the shadowy outline of a person just beyond the glass. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the light of the television. It was just standing there, watching. I rushed to the window, but by the time I opened the blinds, the figure was gone. I checked the yard, the street. Nothing. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The next day, I met my neighbor. She was an older woman, dressed in a worn bathrobe, with stringy gray hair tied up in a messy bun. She came to my door, introduced herself as Mrs. Wren, and immediately started talking about the house I was renting. She spoke in a slow, deliberate manner, her eyes darting around nervously as if she was afraid someone might overhear. "I've lived next door for years," she said, her voice a whisper, "but I've never seen anyone last long in that house. It has a way of driving people out. The last tenants, well, they disappeared. No one knows what happened to them." I smiled awkwardly, trying to brush it off. "It's probably just an old house, creaks and all that." Mrs. Wren's eyes narrowed, and she looked over her shoulder before leaning in closer. "You don't understand. There's something wrong with that house. Something you can't see. It's been that way for as long as I can remember." She didn't explain further, just walked away without another word, leaving me with a sinking feeling in my stomach. The whispers continued, growing more distinct. I could hear them clearly now, late at night, as if someone was standing right behind me. They always said the same thing: "Don't go to sleep." I didn't understand what it meant, but every night the voices grew louder, more desperate, and every night I felt a weight in the air, pressing down on me. Then one night, I finally met my neighbor again. It was after midnight, and I was awake, unable to sleep with the constant tapping coming from the walls. I decided to go for a walk, hoping the cool night air would calm my nerves. As I passed Mrs. Wren's house, I noticed her standing in the window, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I waved, but she didn't respond. I turned away, shaking off the strange feeling that had crept up my spine. I was halfway down the street when I heard it. Footsteps behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just the empty street, the distant hum of crickets. I kept walking, my pace quickening, when I heard it again, this time closer. The sound of footsteps, matching my own. I looked over my shoulder and saw Mrs. Wren. She was standing in the middle of the street, staring at me. "Don't go back," she said softly, her voice barely audible in the stillness of the night. "It's too late for you." I wanted to ask her what she meant, but before I could speak, she turned and walked back toward her house, vanishing into the shadows. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed my bags and called a cab, but as I was walking out the door, I felt it. A cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The house was silent, eerily so. The handle to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside. I screamed, banging on the door, but no one answered. In a panic, I ran to the window, hoping to break it open, but that's when I saw it. Mrs. Wren was standing outside, watching me, and in her hands she held a key. I ran to the door again, but when I looked back, she was gone. The key had vanished, and the door was no longer locked. I don't know how I managed to escape that night, but I did. I've never returned to Harrow Creek, and I never will. But sometimes when I'm alone, I hear those footsteps behind me echoing in the distance, and I know Mrs. Wren is still watching.
Story number 4.
I always thought small towns were safe, quiet, predictable. I lived in a town called Millbrook, a place so small you could walk from one end to the other in under an hour. I moved there after college, looking for a fresh start. The people were kind, the air was clean, and the rent was cheap. It was perfect. That was until I moved into the house on Sycamore Street. It was an old house, maybe over 100 years old. I didn't think much of it at first. I was young, and the thought of living in a house with history was exciting. The landlord, Mr. Forsyth, was a nice enough older man. He gave me the key, showed me around, and told me not to worry about the strange creaks in the floorboards. "It's just the house settling," he said with a smile. The first night, everything was fine. The house was old, but cozy. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the windows rattled in the wind, but it felt like home. I unpacked, made some tea, and sat by the fireplace. The house felt alive, filled with stories I would never know. But that night, when I went to bed, things changed. It started with the mirror. There was an old, full-length mirror in the hallway. It was framed with dark wood, carved with intricate designs, and seemed out of place in the otherwise bare hallway. I didn't think much of it, just glanced at it every time I walked past. But as the night wore on, I began to notice something strange. Every time I passed the mirror, I felt like I wasn't alone, like someone was watching me through the reflection. The feeling grew stronger as the days went on. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just my imagination. But every time I looked into that mirror, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. One night, after a particularly long day, I was walking past the mirror when I saw it. A figure, a girl, standing behind me in the reflection. She was pale, with dark, empty eyes, and her mouth was open as if she was trying to say something, but no sound came out. Her clothes were old-fashioned, like something from a different time. My heart stopped. I spun around, but there was nothing, just the empty hallway. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But the next night, it happened again. The girl was there, standing just behind me in the mirror, staring at me with those hollow eyes. This time, her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I ran out of the house that night, my heart racing, but I couldn't get away from the feeling. The girl was still there in my mind, watching me from that mirror. I went to a bar downtown to try to shake off the fear, but it lingered, like a shadow. The next morning, I went to Mr. Forsyth, hoping he could explain what was happening. His expression darkened when I mentioned the mirror. "Ah, I see," he said softly, his voice distant. "The mirror, it's been here as long as the house has. It's said to be cursed. It's not something you should meddle with. The girl you're seeing, she's not real in the way you think. She's trapped." He paused, his eyes darting to the window, as if he was afraid someone might overhear. "People who've lived here before, they've all seen her, the girl in the mirror. Some try to leave, but she follows them. Others, they vanish." "Vanish?" I asked, my voice shaking. "They disappear. It's like the mirror takes them, like it pulls them in. That's why I've kept it in the house all these years. It's better if no one touches it." I couldn't believe what he was saying. This was absurd. There had to be a logical explanation. But even as I tried to reason with myself, I couldn't ignore the truth in his eyes. The fear. That night, I returned to the house. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But when I walked past the mirror, I saw her again. The girl. She was closer this time, standing just behind me, her hand reaching toward my reflection. I could hear a faint whisper now, barely audible but unmistakable. "Come closer. Come closer." My heart hammered in my chest. I backed away slowly, but the girl's hand was reaching further, her face contorted in a silent scream. I turned and ran out of the house, not stopping until I was at the end of the street. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in that house anymore, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that the girl wasn't just in the mirror. She was everywhere, watching me, following me. I packed my things and left the house that night, leaving the door wide open. I didn't care anymore. I had to get out. But that was the last time I saw Millbrook, the last time I saw my old life. I moved away to a new city, far from the house, far from the girl. But that's when the calls started. Every night at exactly 3 a.m., my phone would ring. It was always a private number. I would answer, and the only sound on the other end was heavy breathing, like someone was waiting for me to speak. And sometimes in the silence of the night, I could swear I heard that whisper again. "Come closer. Come closer. I don't know where she is or how she follows me, but I can't escape her." And sometimes, when I look into a mirror, any mirror, I swear I see her face in the reflection, waiting for me. Story the end.
Story number 5.
My name is Luke, and I'm not a superstitious person. I didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or any of that nonsense. But that was before I moved to Ashwood, a quiet, secluded town nestled deep in the woods, far from the bustling city life I was used to. I had recently lost my job and needed to get away. I thought the isolation would help me clear my head and figure out my next move. I found a small rustic cabin just outside of town. It was perfect. No neighbors for miles. The only sound, the rustling of the leaves in the wind. The rent was cheap, too. The landlord, a thin man named Mr. Green, was friendly but a little odd. He warned me not to venture into town too much, especially around the end of September. "The harvest season is special here," he said cryptically before handing me the keys. I brushed it off as country eccentricity. After all, what harm could there be in a little harvest festival? But the first night I spent in the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept hearing strange noises, scratching sounds against the windows, low murmurs in the wind, like whispers just beyond my hearing. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but it sounded too deliberate, like something or someone was trying to get my attention. I tried to ignore it, but the days leading up to the harvest season grew more unsettling. On the 25th of September, the strange occurrences reached their peak. I had decided to visit Ashwood, figuring I'd check out the so-called harvest festivities and maybe get some answers. I'd barely stepped into the town square when I realized something was wrong. The streets were empty, the shops were shuttered, and the only sign of life was a group of people gathered in the center of town, their faces obscured by dark hoods. I couldn't see much of them, but their eyes, they glowed faintly, like they were reflecting the light of the moon. One of them stepped forward, a man with a gaunt face and a deep, raspy voice. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his words cold, almost as if they weren't meant for me. Before I could respond, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, which slowly began to disperse without another word. The eerie silence that followed was deafening. I tried to leave, but as I turned to walk back to the cabin, something stopped me. The wind picked up, and I heard that familiar whisper again. This time, louder, clearer. "Join us." It wasn't a question, it was a command. Suddenly, my body felt heavy. I couldn't move, as though an invisible force was holding me in place. I struggled, but it was no use. The voices seemed to surround me, pulling me toward the center of the town square. Against my will, I found myself walking toward the gathering of hooded figures. I tried to fight it, but my legs moved on their own. I was drawn in, like a moth to a flame. I couldn't stop myself. As I neared the center, I saw a large stone altar bathed in the light of a full moon. The air smelled thick, like damp earth and something metallic. Around the altar were more hooded figures, chanting in a language I didn't understand. Their voices rose in a terrifying crescendo as I was forced to kneel before them. A tall woman with long, silver hair stepped forward. Her eyes shone bright as she reached down, placing her cold hand on my forehead. Her touch sent a jolt of ice through my body. "The harvest must be completed," she whispered. "It must be done." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My vision blurred, and the ground beneath me felt like it was shifting. I could hear the chanting grow louder, faster, until it felt like my skull would explode. Then I saw it. Behind the altar, standing in the shadows, was a figure, a massive, twisted being with skin like bark and eyes like burning coals. It was watching me. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and it let out a low growl that shook the air. "The sacrifice is needed," the woman said, her voice like honey and poison. "The harvest demands it." I didn't understand. I was about to ask what they meant when I saw them begin to move in closer. One by one, they pulled knives from beneath their robes, long, gleaming blades. My heart raced in terror, but I couldn't move, couldn't escape. They were closing in on me, their cold, pale hands reaching for me. I don't know how long it lasted, but somehow I broke free from the trance. My legs moved again, faster than I thought possible, and I ran as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I just kept running until I reached my cabin, my chest heaving, my heart pounding in my ears. I locked the door and bolted all the windows, not daring to breathe. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, trying to dial the sheriff's office, but the screen wouldn't turn on. The power in the cabin flickered and died. Then I heard it. The tapping, slow and steady, coming from outside. And the whispers. Those same, haunting whispers. "You can't leave. The harvest must be completed." I didn't sleep that night, and I couldn't stay another day in Ashwood. The next morning, I packed up everything I could and left. I didn't care about my stuff, my job, or the money I'd wasted on that cabin. As I drove out of town, I saw the figures again, standing at the edge of the woods, watching me with those glowing eyes. They didn't move, but I knew they were waiting for me to look away. I never went back to Ashwood, and I'll never forget what I saw that night. The twisted creature, the chanting, the sacrifice. If you ever find yourself in a small town during harvest season, remember this. There's something in the woods, something waiting for the right time. And if you're unlucky enough to stay too long, you might just become part of their harvest. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I used to live in a small town called Greendale. It wasn't anything special, just a quiet, sleepy place tucked away from the world. People knew each other by name, and the sound of crickets and rustling leaves filled the night air. I moved there because I thought it would be a fresh start after my divorce, but I never could have predicted what would happen once I settled into my new home. The house I rented was old. Too old. It had been empty for years, according to the landlord, a gruff man named Mr. Pierce. The house itself was beautiful, with high ceilings, wooden floors, and big windows that let in tons of light. It looked perfect on the outside, but as soon as I moved in, I began to feel like there was something wrong with it. Something I couldn't explain. At night, the shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to move. Not in the way shadows do when the light changes, but in a deliberate, sinister way. They would stretch out longer than they should have, or shift as if they were alive. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Then there was the sound. It started off as small noises, a creak in the floorboards, a whisper just at the edge of hearing. But it didn't take long for the noises to escalate. At night, I would hear footsteps upstairs, even though I was the only one in the house. Sometimes I'd wake up to the sound of something dragging along the floor, like a chair being moved across a room, but when I'd check, nothing was out of place. I kept telling myself it was just the house settling, but I wasn't convinced. One night I woke up to a strange feeling in my chest, like something was pressing down on me. I opened my eyes, and there, standing at the foot of my bed, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but I could see its long, bony fingers reaching toward me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was paralyzed with fear. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, I called Mr. Pierce and asked if anyone had ever died in the house. He hesitated for a moment before saying, "People have lived there, sure, but nothing like that." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't push him further. I wasn't ready to hear what I might already know. That evening, things took a darker turn. I went for a walk to clear my mind, hoping some fresh air would help. As I wandered down Maple Street, I passed an old, crumbling house that was even older than mine. It had been abandoned for years, but I still saw the flickering light of a candle in one of the windows from time to time. I was about to turn back when I heard a voice, a soft, familiar whisper, so quiet I almost didn't catch it. "Come closer." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice sounded like it was coming from the house. I looked up at the window, and for a brief moment, I could make out the outline of a figure, just like the one I had seen at the foot of my bed. It was standing there, staring at me through the window with hollow, black eyes. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my own house, heart pounding in my chest. The rest of the night was quiet, too quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent the next few days looking over my shoulder, wondering if the figure would come back. But the worst part came a week later. I had just gotten back from a grocery run and was unloading my car when I noticed something strange. A piece of paper had been slipped under the door. I bent down and picked it up. It was old, yellowed with age, and covered in uneven handwriting. The message read, "The shadow will follow you. It has always followed. It will never leave." I nearly dropped the paper in horror. My mind raced. Who could have left this, and why? That night, the house felt different. The air was thick, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to go down to the basement to check the fuse box. It was old and had been acting up lately, and I thought I could at least fix the lights. As I walked down the narrow staircase, I felt a chill run down my spine. The basement was colder than usual, and I could hear something, a soft tapping sound coming from the far corner. I didn't want to investigate, but I had to. I turned on the light and moved toward the source of the sound. It was there, in the far corner of the basement, an old, full-length mirror. I had never seen it before. I hadn't noticed it when I first moved in, but now it was as if it had always been there, waiting for me. The surface of the mirror was foggy, like it hadn't been cleaned in years. But as I stepped closer, the fog cleared, and I saw something. A figure was reflected in the mirror. It was the same figure, the tall, thin shape with the wide-brimmed hat, but this time it was different. It was smiling. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, but I couldn't look away. The figure reached out of the mirror, its bony fingers stretching toward me. I stumbled back, tripping over my feet, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. The mirror was completely empty, as though nothing had ever been there at all. I ran up the stairs, locked all the doors, and stayed awake all night, terrified to close my eyes. That morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't care if I had to live on the streets. I wasn't staying in that house for another night. Before I left town, I stopped at the local diner to grab a cup of coffee. While I was sitting there, a man across the room caught my eye. He was older, with graying hair and a rough-looking face. He stared at me for a long moment before speaking. "You shouldn't have gone into that house," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "It's not just a house, it's part of the town. The shadow you saw, it's not just a spirit. It's something much older. It will follow you for the rest of your life." I didn't know what to say. I just left. I've moved several times since then, but I can still feel it, like a cold weight on my chest. The shadow hasn't left me. Every now and then I'll catch a glimpse of a tall, thin figure out of the corner of my eye. And every time I feel those bony fingers reaching for me. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I should have known better than to accept that job in a place like Gracefield. It's the kind of town you drive through without giving it a second glance, small, forgotten, and isolated. But after my divorce, I needed a change, a fresh start. So when I found an ad for a temporary position at a local antique shop, I figured it would be the perfect escape. The shop, run by an elderly man named Mr. Whitley, was a peculiar place. It had a strange smell, like old wood and something else, something metallic. There was something off about it, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Still, the pay was good, and it was quiet, which is exactly what I needed. One day, while cleaning the back room, I came across a small, dust-covered door tucked in the corner. I had never noticed it before. When I opened it, I found a narrow staircase leading down into a dimly lit basement. Mr. Whitley had never mentioned anything about a basement. I decided to take a look. The air down there was thick and musty, and the moment I stepped onto the old wood floor, I felt a cold chill creep up my spine. The basement was cluttered with shelves, old furniture, and stacks of boxes. But there in the center of the room was something that caught my attention. A long wooden workbench with rows of delicate, unfinished dolls sitting on it. Their glassy eyes stared at me as if they were alive, and their small, fragile bodies seemed to twitch whenever I looked away. I picked one up, an old-fashioned doll with a porcelain face, dressed in a faded yellow dress. Its expression was unsettling, frozen in a perpetual smile, but there was something wrong with it. It didn't look like any doll I'd ever seen. Its eyes were too lifelike, too knowing. I was so distracted by it that I didn't hear Mr. Fred Whitley coming down the stairs. "You shouldn't be down here," he said, his voice gravelly, as if he hadn't spoken in years. I dropped the doll back onto the bench, startled. Mr. Whitley was standing behind me, his pale, wrinkled face set in a grim expression. His eyes, though, were wide and fearful. "These dolls," he said, his voice shaking, "they're not just toys, they're things." He explained that he had been making dolls for decades. The ones on the workbench were special, more detailed than any of his other creations. But they had a curse, one that had been passed down through generations of doll makers in his family. Each doll had a soul, a trapped spirit inside it, one that could never escape. "They begged to be freed," Mr. Whitley whispered, glancing nervously at the dolls. "But every time you finish one, the spirit grows stronger. And when the last doll is completed," his voice trailed off and he shuddered. I didn't believe him, of course. He was an old man with a strange obsession, nothing more. I figured he had just let his imagination get the better of him. I didn't think much of it after that, but the next few days at work felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sometimes, when I passed the basement door, I thought I heard soft scraping noises from below. Other times, the dolls seemed to shift ever so slightly as though they were moving when I wasn't looking. Then it happened. One evening, after closing the shop, I was alone. I stayed late to finish some paperwork, the lights dim in the quiet store. I heard a faint sound from downstairs, like footsteps. My first instinct was to go check it out, but the thought of Mr. Whitley's warning stopped me. I told myself it was just my imagination. But when I heard a soft giggle, a child's giggle, coming from the basement, I froze. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed a flashlight and hurried down the stairs. The basement was darker than usual, the only light coming from the faint glow of the flashlight beam. The dolls were all still there, sitting motionless on the workbench. But something had changed. One of the dolls, the doll I had picked up, was no longer on the table. I searched the room, my heart pounding, and there, in the far corner, I saw it. The doll was standing upright. Its porcelain face was no longer smiling. It was staring at me with wide, hollow eyes. And in that moment, I felt it. Something was there in the room with me. I wasn't alone. I backed away slowly, but my foot caught on a loose floorboard. The doll tilted its head to the side as if it were studying me, and the air grew impossibly cold. Then, without warning, the other dolls began to move. At first it was subtle, a slight twitch, a shift in position, but then they all started to move at once, their glass eyes following my every move. Panic surged through me. I turned to run, but the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I was trapped. Suddenly, I heard a voice, soft, whispering, coming from all around me. It was the voice of a child, but it sounded wrong, twisted. It spoke in a language I couldn't understand, the words flowing like a song. "Let us go." The doll's eyes flickered with dark energy, and I knew that something was about to happen. I didn't know what would happen, but I knew it would be bad. The air was thick with a suffocating pressure, like the room itself was closing in on me. I screamed and banged on the door, desperate to escape. The sound of footsteps echoed through the room, but when I turned around, there was no one there. The dolls were now standing, all of them, on the workbench. Their bodies jerked unnaturally, like they were moving of their own accord. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. With all the strength I had left, I broke open the door and ran out of the basement, up the stairs, and into the night. I never went back to that shop. The next day I called Mr. Whitley. The phone rang and rang, but no one picked up. I went to the shop, but it was closed. When I peered inside, I saw the dolls, every single one of them, sitting on the shelves, staring at me with those unblinking eyes. But there was something different now. They were waiting. I left Gracefield shortly after that. The memories of the dollmaker's workshop still haunt me, and I still hear the faint giggles in my dreams. I don't know what happened to Mr. Whitley or if he ever finished those cursed dolls, but I do know one thing. Some dolls don't just carry the souls of the dead. Some dolls become the dead.
Story number 8.
I never believed in ghosts. Not really. I grew up in a town called Everbrook, a sleepy little place where nothing much ever happened. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other's business, and the biggest scandal was the annual bake-off. But after my parents passed away, I found myself moving back to the family home. It was a big, old house, the kind you only find in towns like Everbrook. I didn't think much of it at first, just needed a place to get away and figure out my next steps. The house had been empty for years. My parents had left it to me, and it seemed like a good idea to make it my own. There was something comforting about being back in the house I grew up in. But as soon as I moved in, things started to feel off. At first, it was small things. A door left slightly ajar when I knew I had closed it. Shadows that didn't quite make sense in the corners of rooms. But it wasn't until I found the mirror that things really started to get strange. It was in the attic, buried under old furniture and dusty boxes. I had been up there, sorting through my parents' belongings, when I saw it, a large antique mirror leaning against the wall. I'd never noticed it before, but I didn't think much of it. It was beautiful, with an ornate wooden frame and a glass surface that shimmered despite the dust. I thought it might be worth cleaning up and putting somewhere in the house. That night, after dinner, I decided to move it. I set it up in the hallway, facing a wall where I thought it might fit. As soon as I stepped back to look at it, I felt a chill run down my spine. The reflection in the mirror was wrong. It was darker, somehow. The hallway looked the same, but the reflection in the mirror had an odd, distorted quality to it. I couldn't explain it, but I felt uneasy, like the mirror was watching me. The next few days were uneventful, or so I thought. But soon I began to notice things, small things. When I would pass by the mirror in the hallway, I could see movements in the reflection that didn't match what was happening in the room. I would turn and look. Nothing. But when I looked into the mirror again, there would be a shadow, a flicker, like someone or something was standing just out of sight. I tried to ignore it. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. But then it got worse. One night I woke up to hear footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate steps. I froze, listening, hoping it was just the house settling. But the steps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside my bedroom door. My heart was pounding in my chest. I slowly turned on the bedside lamp and peeked out the door, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, the silence almost deafening. But then I remembered the mirror. I rushed to the hallway, and there in the reflection, I saw it, standing just out of sight, at the edge of the hallway, near the stairs. A tall figure, black as night, with long, thin limbs. It was watching me through the mirror, but when I looked back, the hallway was empty. I ran back to my room and locked the door. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I tried to get rid of the mirror. I thought maybe it was cursed or something. But no matter where I moved it, it always ended up in the hallway, as if it had a mind of its own. Every time I passed by it, the figure was there, watching me, lurking in the corner of the reflection. That's when things started to get truly terrifying. I began hearing whispers, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. They came from the direction of the mirror, and at first I thought it was just the wind. But soon the whispers became more distinct, and the voice began to call my name. It wasn't my voice, or anyone I recognized. It was a low, raspy voice, and it always seemed to say the same thing. Come closer. I didn't want to go near it. But one night, against my better judgment, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, drawn to it as if by some invisible force. My breath fogged up the glass as I leaned closer, my reflection warping in front of me. The shadows in the corner of the reflection were darker now, and the figure was closer, its form more distinct. I could see its face, a twisted, grotesque thing, hollow-eyed and twisted in a smile that seemed far too wide for its face. "Come closer," it whispered again, its voice like 1,000 echoes. I stumbled backward, horrified, and the figure in the mirror followed my every move, that grinning as it grew closer, its limbs stretching out unnaturally long. I ran to my phone, desperate to get out of the house, but when I looked back at the mirror, I saw something even worse. The figure wasn't just in the reflection anymore. It was in the hallway, standing just behind me, its cold breath on the back of my neck. Before I could scream, the lights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. I felt an intense pressure, like something was pulling at my skin, wrapping around me, trying to drag me into the mirror. I don't remember how long I was there. It felt like hours, but it could have been mere minutes. When I finally opened my eyes, the mirror was gone. The hallway was empty, and everything felt still, like nothing had ever happened. I left the house that night. I couldn't stay there anymore. I don't know what the mirror was or what it wanted, but I knew I had to get out before it took me. I'm still not sure if it was a ghost, a demon, or something worse. All I know is that the mirror wasn't just reflecting my world. It was pulling from somewhere else, somewhere dark. And whatever it was, it's still out there.
Story number 9.
I had just graduated from college and was looking for a fresh start, somewhere quiet and away from the bustle of city life. So when I heard about a small town called Elmstead, I thought it was the perfect place to get my feet under me. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, with a single street of shops and a railway station at the edge of town. I rented a small apartment in an old building above a bakery. The place was cheap, and I loved the cozy, almost nostalgic feel of it. The bakery downstairs had the best cinnamon rolls I had ever tasted, and the quiet town was exactly what I needed after the chaos of school. But there was something strange about Elmstead. It was too quiet, almost unnaturally so. People would say hello when you passed them, but there was always a look in their eyes, like they were hiding something. The town had a peculiar atmosphere, especially at night. One evening, after a long day of settling in, I went out for a walk. The sun was setting, casting long shadows on the empty streets. I passed the railway station where the old tracks ran out toward the woods. There was a bench near the platform where an elderly man sat staring off into the distance. "Good evening," I said, walking by. He didn't respond, just stared ahead. His gaze was hollow, his face pale and drawn, like someone who hadn't slept in years. I kept walking, but the man's unblinking stare stayed with me. It felt unsettling, like his eyes were following me, even though I had already moved out of view. I shook it off and continued my walk. The next day, the bakery owner, Mrs. Willows, who was always kind and friendly, warned me to stay away from the train station after dark. "You don't want to catch the last train," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It doesn't come from around here." Her words lingered with me. I couldn't make sense of them, but I pushed it out of my mind. It was probably just local superstition. That evening, after dinner, I decided to walk down to the station again. It was a strange impulse, but something about it felt compelling. As I approached, the sky had grown dark, and the station was silent. Not a single person in sight. I walked up to the platform, peering down the tracks, and that's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of an approaching train. The problem? There was no train scheduled for this time. I froze. The sound grew louder, closer, but there was no train in sight. The air grew cold, and I could feel my heartbeat quicken. Then, out of the dark, I saw it. A train. Its headlights piercing the blackness, coming down the tracks at full speed. But there was something wrong about it. The train was old, covered in rust, and the windows were completely dark, as though the carriages were empty. I took a step back, my mind racing. Should I run? What was happening? But before I could move, the train came to a sudden, screeching halt right in front of me. The doors opened slowly, one by one, revealing complete darkness inside. I could hear faint, indistinguishable murmurs like voices calling from deep within the train. A cold wind blew from the doors, carrying the scent of damp earth and something metallic. Then I saw something I'll never forget. A figure standing at the far end of the train, looking out the door. It was a man, but his face was completely featureless, smooth like a mannequin. He stared at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Without thinking, I turned to run, but my legs felt heavy, as if I were moving through molasses. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel them surrounding me, pulling me back toward the train. The last thing I heard before I broke free from the hold was the soft, eerie laughter of the figure. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment, slamming the door shut behind me. I was out of breath, my mind racing with fear. What had I just seen? Was I losing my mind? The next morning, I gathered the courage to ask Mrs. Willows about the train. Her face turned pale, and she quickly glanced around as if making sure no one was listening. She leaned in close and whispered, "That train? It doesn't belong to Elmstead. It's a train that only comes at night, Tate, and it brings people who shouldn't be here. It's been coming for years, but no one talks about it." I was about to ask her more, but she hurriedly ushered me out of the bakery, her expression grave. "Just stay away from the station," she urged. "No good can come of it." But I couldn't ignore it. Something was pulling me to that train, and the more I tried to stay away, the more I felt its grip tightening. Later that week, I found an old newspaper article in the town library. The headline read, "Train accident claims dozens, no bodies found." The article was from nearly 60 years ago, but there was no mention of where the train had come from, just that a massive crash had occurred just outside of Elmstead, no survivors, and strangely, no wreckage. The article ended with a chilling line. Authorities believe the train itself may have vanished. That night, I couldn't resist. I went back to the station, determined to uncover the truth. This time, I brought a flashlight and a camera, thinking I could somehow capture evidence of what was happening. As I approached the tracks, the air grew thick and heavy, like the weight of the whole town was pressing down on me. The train arrived again, just as before, its eerie, rusted form creeping toward me. But this time, I was ready. I stepped onto the platform, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I shone the light down the tracks, but there was no train in sight. It had vanished. I turned in a circle, heart racing. Where was it? And then from behind me, I heard a sound, a low, guttural whisper, almost like a groan. I turned quickly, and there it was, the train, right behind me, its doors creaking open. The figure stood at the far end, but this time there were others with him. Dozens of faceless figures, all lined up, all staring at me with empty, soulless eyes. The whispering grew louder, the voices blending into a deafening roar, and I knew in the pit of my stomach that if I stepped inside, I wouldn't be coming back. I ran. I didn't look back. I heard the train's doors slam shut behind me, and the whispers slowly faded away, but I kept running until I couldn't hear them anymore. I never went back to Elmstead after that. I packed my things and left as quickly as I could, the haunting memory of the train chasing me out of town. I still hear the whispers sometimes in the back of my mind, calling me to come back, but I know better now. The last train is still out there, waiting, and if you're not careful, it might just come for you. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I live in a small town, the kind where everyone knows everyone and nothing ever happens. At least, that's what we thought. My name's Sarah, and I've lived here my entire life. I know every crack in the sidewalk, every house on the street, and every face in the town. But there's one thing I can't explain. Something that's been haunting me for months. Something that started when I moved into the old house on Elm Street. It wasn't much, just a rundown 2-story house that had been empty for years. When I first saw it, the place looked abandoned. The windows were boarded up, the paint was peeling, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. But it was cheap, and I needed a place to stay. So, against everyone's advice, I signed the lease and moved in. The first few nights were fine. The house was cold, but I could handle that. It wasn't until the third night that I heard it, the first whisper. I was in bed, drifting off to sleep, when I heard it. A faint voice, almost like a murmur, coming from the walls. It was so quiet that at first I thought I imagined it. I brushed it off as the house settling. But as the days went by, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It was like someone was speaking to me through the walls, their voice muffled but desperate. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just the house creaking, or maybe even rats. But then, one night, the whispers stopped, and that's when I started to hear the tapping. It was rhythmic at first, like a faint knock on the wall. Tap, tap, tap. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. It didn't sound like it was from the other side of the wall. It felt closer, like it was coming from inside the walls. I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and started searching the house, convinced that someone was messing with me. I checked every room, the attic, the basement, nothing. The tapping continued that night, and the next, and the next. It became a nightly ritual, each tap sending shivers down my spine. It was never loud, but it was constant. And then one evening, something changed. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. Heavy, slow steps like someone was pacing back and forth. My heart raced. I wasn't expecting anyone. My first instinct was to call the landlord, but then I remembered he told me the house had been empty for years. No one should have been there. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and crept up the stairs. The footsteps stopped as soon as I reached the top. I stood in the hallway, my hand trembling on the doorknob of the room where the sound had come from. My breath caught in my throat. The air was thick, like I was standing in a fog. I opened the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was empty, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. I scanned the corners, the closet, and under the bed. Nothing. I was about to turn and leave when I saw it, the corner of a small piece of paper sticking out from under the floorboards. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled it free. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and torn at the edges. It looked like something from a journal. I read the words aloud before I could stop myself. They're here. They'll never leave. You'll never leave. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what to make of it. Who wrote this? What did it mean? My hands shook as I crumpled the paper and shoved it in my pocket. I didn't want to think about it anymore. But that night, things got worse. I was lying in bed, the tapping louder than ever, when I felt a cold breeze wash over me. I pulled the blanket tighter, but it didn't help. I could feel it, the weight of something in the room with me. I opened my eyes, but I couldn't see anything. Still, the air felt charged, like static electricity in the air. And then, just as I was about to close my eyes again, I saw it. A figure standing at the foot of my bed. A shadow, tall and thin, with eyes that glowed an unnatural white. It was staring at me, unmoving, as if waiting for something. I couldn't scream. My mouth wouldn't work. I tried to move, but my body was frozen. The figure slowly tilted its head as if studying me, and then it spoke. "Get out!" The voice was deep, raspy, and yet somehow familiar. It echoed in my mind, a voice I had heard before, in the whispers. I didn't wait to hear anything more. I jumped out of bed and ran out of the room, down the stairs, and out the front door. I didn't stop running until I reached the town square. The next day, I went to the town library. I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening to me. The librarian, an old woman who had been there forever, looked at me with a knowing gaze when I asked about the house on Elm Street. "You're not the first one," she said, her voice trembling. "That house, it's cursed. It's been empty for decades. But before that, there was a family. They disappeared one night, and no one ever found out what happened to them. But people say that whoever moves in, they're never the same again." I left the library with more questions than answers. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew the truth now. The whispers, the tapping, the shadow, they were all connected. And now they wanted me gone. I didn't go back to the house that night. I packed my things and left, leaving everything behind. The next morning, the house was gone. No sign of it. No evidence it had ever existed. Just an empty lot. I haven't been back since, but every time I close my eyes, I can hear the whispers. And sometimes, late at night, I feel the cold breath of the shadow following me. And I know no matter where I go, it's never really gone. Story the end.
Story number 11.
I never believed in ghosts. Growing up, I thought haunted houses were just stories meant to entertain or scare kids. But that was before I moved to Thorn Manor. It's an old mansion on the edge of the tiny town of Redfield. The kind of place that looks like it belongs in a Gothic novel. Tall, dark, and imposing, with ivy creeping up the sides and a weathered stone wall surrounding the property. I wasn't planning on staying long. I had just gotten out of a toxic relationship and needed a quiet place to reset. The fact that Thorn Manor was available for rent and for a relatively low price seemed like a sign, a fresh start. When I first arrived, the house seemed perfect, cold and creaky, but full of character. The ceilings were high, the rooms were spacious, and the view from the attic window was breathtaking. What I didn't expect was the mirror. It wasn't large, but it was ancient. A heavy, ornate frame in the shape of twisting vines placed at the end of the long hallway on the second floor. I didn't think much of it at first. In fact, it was so ordinary that I didn't even bother cleaning it when I moved in. But over the course of the next few weeks, I began to notice something strange. Every time I passed by that hallway, the mirror seemed to draw me in. At first, I just thought it was my reflection, but there was something off about it. The edges of my reflection would blur as if it didn't quite match my movements. The first night I saw it clearly was the worst. It was late, and I was walking down the hall to grab a drink of water. The house was deathly quiet, the floorboards creaking under my feet, the cold air creeping in from the open windows. When I passed the mirror, I glanced at it without thinking, and that's when I saw it. Someone else standing beside me in the reflection. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the light, but when I turned to look, there was no one there. I stared at the mirror, my heart racing. There, in the reflection, stood a woman. She was dressed in a long black gown that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Her long hair was wild and untamed, and her face was pale, almost lifeless. She didn't move, she just stood there, staring at me with hollow eyes. I blinked and she was gone. I backed away slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't know if I was imagining it or if something was really wrong with that mirror, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that house anymore. Over the next few days, the presence in the mirror grew stronger. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of the woman out of the corner of my eye, her image flickering like a shadow. Other times, I'd walk past the mirror and feel an overwhelming sense of dread, as though something was pulling me toward it, compelling me to look into it. One night, unable to sleep, I stood before the mirror again, daring myself to confront whatever was haunting it. The air felt thick, suffocating. The shadows in the hallway seemed to move as I stared into the glass. Slowly, my reflection began to change. I saw the woman again, but this time she wasn't standing still. She was moving. Her head tilted to the side and her lips parted as if she were trying to say something, but no sound came out. Her eyes were wide, empty, like black holes, and her hands stretched out toward the glass. I reached out to touch the mirror, drawn to her, even though my instincts screamed at me to run. As soon as my fingers brushed the cold glass, everything went dark. When I woke up, I was no longer in the hallway. I was standing in a dark, unfamiliar room, a dim light flickering from the corner. The walls were covered in dust, and the air smelled old, like rot. My heart was pounding as I stumbled forward, trying to make sense of what was happening. I turned around and froze. The woman from the mirror was standing behind me. Her face was twisted in an expression of agony, her eyes wide with fear. But she wasn't just a reflection now. She was real, solid, and she was right there, inches from me. Before I could react, she reached out with icy fingers, touching my arm. A cold, seeping sensation spread through my body, freezing me in place. Her voice, though faint and raspy, echoed in my mind. "Help me." I tried to pull away, but it was like my limbs had turned to stone. Panic surged through me, and I fought to break free. With all my strength, I yanked my arm back, stumbling away from her. As I turned to run, the world around me seemed to shift, distorting like a bad dream. I awoke on the floor of the hallway, gasping for air. The mirror was just where it had always been, hanging innocently on the wall, reflecting nothing but darkness. But I knew something had changed. I couldn't escape her. Every time I looked in the mirror now, she was there. Not just as a reflection, but as a presence, standing behind me, staring at me. She wasn't trying to hurt me, but the feeling of her eyes on me, the weight of her presence, it was unbearable. I realized that this woman wasn't just haunting the mirror, she was trapped in it, and her soul was desperate to escape. That night, after hours of pacing in the house, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the mirror one last time, determined to confront whatever was holding her there. "I'll help you," I whispered, even though I wasn't sure what that meant. "I'll help you get out." The mirror flickered, the woman's image blurring, her mouth moving as if she were trying to speak. Then, with a violent crack, the glass shattered. I screamed and stumbled back as shards of glass flew across the room, but there was no one there. The mirror was gone. Just an empty frame remained on the wall. But the silence that followed was even worse. I never saw the woman again, but I can still feel her presence, lurking just out of sight, waiting. I left Thorn Manor the next morning, and I've never looked back. But every time I pass a mirror, any mirror, I feel a chill run down my spine, and I wonder if she's still there, watching. Story the end.
Story number 12.
I'd heard the rumors before I ever set foot in Rose Hill. The small town had a reputation. Whispers of strange occurrences, people disappearing, lights in the woods at night. It all sounded like the stuff of urban legends, but there was something in my gut that made me think otherwise. I was looking for a new start, and Rose Hill seemed like the perfect quiet town to put my past behind me. The town had that eerie, vintage charm you can only find in places that time forgot. The main street was lined with old brick buildings, their windows dark and dust-covered, like they hadn't been opened in decades. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. It was beautiful in a way, but there was something unsettling about it, like the whole town was holding its breath. I rented a small, run-down house at the edge of town. It wasn't much, but the price was right, and it had a view of the woods that surrounded Rose Hill. The locals were friendly enough, but there was always that unspoken tension hanging in the air. When I first arrived, I tried to chat with a few of them, but their answers were always short, and they would quickly change the subject when I asked about the woods. One evening, after being in town for about a week, I decided to take a walk through the woods behind my house. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the trees, and the air was cooler than usual, a sign that fall was fast approaching. I figured a walk would clear my mind, help me get used to the quiet. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the atmosphere grew heavier, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. The farther I walked, the more the feeling of isolation seemed to press in. It was unnaturally still, no birds singing, no rustling in the underbrush. It felt like the woods were holding their breath, just like the town. After a while, I came across something that made my skin crawl. There was a small clearing in the woods, and in the center of it stood a dilapidated well, overgrown with vines. The well looked ancient, its stone walls cracked and covered in moss. It didn't seem like it had been touched in years, maybe even centuries. But what caught my attention wasn't the well itself, it was the lights. They were faint at first, like the glow of distant lanterns, flickering at the edges of the clearing. At first, I thought it was just the fading light of the setting sun playing tricks on my eyes. But as I watched, the lights grew brighter and more distinct. They were small, hovering just above the ground, moving in and out of the trees like they had a life of their own. I stepped closer, curiosity pulling me forward despite the chill creeping up my spine. The lights were like nothing I had ever seen before. Pale, almost ghostly, and they seemed to be beckoning me closer. My heart began to race, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. But I couldn't tear myself away. The lights moved in a way that felt deliberate, like they were leading me somewhere. Suddenly, one of the lights darted toward me, and I flinched back in surprise. It hovered in front of me for a moment, its faint glow illuminating my face before it shot off into the trees, disappearing into the growing darkness. The other lights followed one by one, vanishing into the woods. I stood there, breathless, unsure of what I had just witnessed. The woods were silent again, the eerie stillness returning. But just as I turned to leave, I heard something, a soft, distant whisper, barely audible, coming from the direction of the well. I froze. "Stay." It was a voice, faint but clear, like a soft sigh carried on the wind. It didn't sound like any of the animals in the woods, and it certainly didn't sound like a human. The voice was almost hollow, empty. I turned toward the well instinctively, my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me. I stepped closer to the well, unable to resist. The whisper came again, this time louder, more urgent. "Stay! Come closer." I should have run. I knew that. But something inside me was drawn to it, pulled by an invisible force. I stepped forward, one foot after the other, until I was standing right at the edge of the well. The whisper was louder now, echoing in my mind, drowning out everything else. And then I saw it. At the bottom of the well, glowing faintly in the darkness, was a face, a pale face, staring up at me. It was impossible to make out any features, just the shape of a face, glowing from some unknown light beneath the surface. The face was watching me, its eyes unblinking, its mouth slightly open as though it was trying to speak. I took a step back, my pulse hammering in my throat. My feet tangled in the roots beneath me, and I stumbled, my eyes never leaving the well. That's when I heard it, the sound of movement behind me, like footsteps in the woods, slowly, deliberately approaching. I turned around, and there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. A tall figure dressed in a long coat, their face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there, watching me. The whisper came again, now accompanied by a low, growling hum that vibrated in my chest. "Leave, before it's too late." My feet were frozen. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was pressing in on me, suffocating me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, from the face in the well. Suddenly, the figure raised one hand and pointed at the well. "It's calling you." I snapped out of the trance, adrenaline flooding my veins. I turned and ran, my legs moving on their own, ignoring the branches and thorns tearing at my clothes. I didn't stop until I was back at my house, slamming the door behind me, gasping for air. That night, I locked every door, every window. I didn't sleep. I just sat in the dark, listening to the sounds of the woods outside, waiting for something to come. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't say goodbye to anyone in Rose Hill. I didn't need to. The lights in the woods were no longer just stories. I knew what they were. They were the lost souls of people who had come too close, people who had been drawn into the woods and never returned. And now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Every time I pass a forest, I can hear the faintest whisper on the wind calling me to return. But I know better now. Some things are meant to stay in the dark. Story the end.
Story number 13.
I moved to Black Hollow to escape the chaos of the city. I needed peace, a fresh start. The small town was perfect for that. A tight-knit community, friendly faces, and acres of sprawling woods that seemed to go on forever. When I found a charming little cottage at the edge of the forest, I thought I'd stumbled upon the perfect place to begin again. I met the landlord, Mr. Carter, a kind older man with a weathered face and a stoic demeanor. He gave me the keys and warned me, in a low voice, that I should stay out of the woods after dusk. "The woods aren't what they seem," he said cryptically. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the ramblings of an old man. How dangerous could a forest be? The first few days in the cottage were blissfully quiet. The sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows that made the forest feel alive, as if it was breathing. At night, I'd sit by the fireplace with a book, the crackling flames my only companion. Everything seemed normal, until the whispers began. It started on the third night. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard it, faint at first, like a distant murmur coming from the woods. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the wind or animals. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder. It sounded like voices, many voices, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The whispers weren't just at night anymore. They seemed to follow me wherever I went, filling the air around me. It felt as if they were watching me, waiting for something. One evening, after a particularly long day, I decided to take a walk into the woods. It was just before sunset, and the trees were bathed in an eerie orange glow. I figured it might clear my mind, and besides, I'd been hearing the voices for days, and was curious to know where they were coming from. I crossed the threshold of the forest, the dense canopy swallowing up the last light of day. As I ventured deeper, the whispers grew louder, but now they sounded clearer. It was almost like someone was calling my name. I called out, but the only response was the sound of wind rustling through the leaves. I walked for what felt like hours, the path winding and twisting, though I was certain I hadn't veered off course. The deeper I went, the more unsettling the whispers became. They weren't just voices anymore. They were calls, pleading, desperate, as if the woods were begging me to turn back. But I couldn't stop. I had to know what was happening. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing. At the center of the clearing stood a large stone circle, ancient and overgrown with moss. The air felt thick, heavy, and for the first time I felt something cold wash over me. A chill ran down my spine, and the whispers stopped. Dead silence. That's when I saw it. In the center of the stone circle there was a figure. Tall, shadowy, almost human, but not quite. It had long, spindly arms and a face covered by a hood, its features obscured by the shadows. But what froze me in place wasn't its appearance. It was the way it moved. It wasn't walking. It was shifting, as though it was made of smoke, flowing between the stones without a single step. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, staring at this figure, its hollow, empty eyes locked onto mine. Then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was not like a normal voice. It wasn't even human. It echoed in my mind, reverberating deep within my bones. I felt the words more than I heard them, like they were pressing into my skin. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. My body was frozen, my mind racing with terror. "You are too late." The figure stepped forward, its arms extending, reaching toward me with fingers that were too long, too thin. It was like watching a nightmare come to life, and I was trapped in it. Suddenly, the ground beneath me trembled, and I could hear a low, rumbling sound, like something waking from a deep slumber. The forest seemed to shift, and I realized I wasn't alone. The shadows in the trees were moving, swirling, forming shapes that were far too familiar. They were like people, or what had once been people. The figure in the center of the circle grinned, a grotesque, twisted smile, and then in a single motion it reached out and touched my forehead. A rush of images flooded my mind, visions of other faces, other people who had come to this place. They were all like me, drawn into the woods by the whispers, by the voices, only to disappear without a trace. Their faces were locked in a scream, but their eyes were empty, hollow. I tried to scream, to fight back, but I couldn't. I felt my mind slipping away, my sense of self fading, becoming part of the forest, part of the darkness that had claimed all those who had come before me. But just as it felt like I was losing myself completely, a loud crack broke through the silence. The ground trembled again, and the figure recoiled, its grip loosening. In that moment, I broke free, stumbling backward. I ran faster than I had ever run before, through the twisting trees, the whispers following me, growing fainter and fainter as I neared the edge of the woods. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. I looked back once more, but there was nothing. The woods were silent again, peaceful, like nothing had ever happened. The next day, I moved out of Black Hollow. I packed my things, never looking back, and left that town behind. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear it, the whispers calling my name, begging me to return. And I know now I never truly escaped the woods. It's still out there waiting, and it's not done with me yet.
Story number 14.
I never planned on ending up in Forest Hollow. It was just a stop on my way to somewhere else, a small, forgettable town tucked away on a winding back road. But I made the mistake of taking a wrong turn, and what should have been a brief stop for gas turned into something much darker. The first thing I noticed when I entered Forest Hollow was how quiet it was. Too quiet. The streets were empty. No cars on the road. No people walking around. The town had a strange, almost oppressive stillness to it, as if everyone was hiding from something. The gas station was the only place that seemed open. The attendant, an older man with graying hair, barely looked up when I walked in. I asked him for directions to the nearest highway, and he gave me a brief, disinterested answer. But as I was about to leave, I noticed something that made me pause. A set of old, faded postcards on the counter. They were all of the same place, the woods just outside of town. The Whistling Woods, the postcard read in faded, yellowed letters. The image on the front was a dark forest with towering trees that seemed to reach up to an ominous sky. The caption on the bottom read, "Not all who wander are lost. Some never return." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't say anything. Instead, I bought a bottle of water, nodded politely to the attendant, and left. As I drove out of town, the road began to narrow, the trees closing in around me, their branches twisting like gnarled hands reaching for the sky. I didn't think much of it at first, just focused on the road ahead. But then I heard it. A low, haunting whistle carried through the air. It sounded like it was coming from deep in the forest. I slowed down, peering into the woods, but all I could see were the dense trees and shadows. The whistle echoed again, this time closer. It wasn't a bird or an animal. It was a person, whistling a slow, deliberate tune. I turned off the engine and sat in silence, my breath catching in my throat. The air was thick with tension. I shouldn't have gone into the woods, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I turned my car down a small dirt path that led deeper into the forest. The trees closed in around me, their branches creaking in the wind. The whistling grew louder, a rhythmic sound that seemed to pull me deeper, closer to whatever, or whoever, was making it. I parked my car at the edge of the woods and got out, the leaves crunching beneath my feet. The deeper I went, the more unnerving the silence became. The whistling continued, but it wasn't just a tune anymore. It was something else. There was a sense of longing in it, like someone calling to me, trying to lure me closer. As I ventured further, I saw something that made my heart race. A figure, standing at the edge of a small clearing. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadow, their face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. But what stood out was the way they moved, slowly, deliberately, like they were waiting for me to come closer. The whistling stopped. The figure didn't turn to look at me, but I could feel its eyes on me, like a cold, invisible weight pressing against my chest. My legs felt heavy, and I suddenly felt very alone, as though the entire forest was watching me. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they took a step forward, and the sound of their boots on the ground was unnervingly loud in the silence. With every step they took, the air seemed to grow colder, the trees seeming to close in on me. Then, without warning, the figure raised one hand and pointed toward the far end of the clearing. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know. but I couldn't help myself. I turned my head, and that's when I saw it. There in the distance was a small dilapidated cabin. Its windows were dark and the door hung slightly ajar as though it had been abandoned for years. But something about it felt wrong. There was a feeling in the air, an oppressive weight that made it impossible to breathe. And then I saw it. A shadow, moving quickly behind the cabin, darting out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to turn and run, but my body wouldn't obey. The whistling started up again, louder now, closer. It was as if the woods themselves were singing, calling out to me. The figure took another step toward me, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, even though no one was there. "Leave now," the figure whispered, their voice low and gravelly, "before it's too late." I didn't wait for another word. I ran. I ran through the woods, branches scratching at my face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whistling grew louder, closer, following me, surrounding me. I could feel the presence of something behind me, chasing me through the dark trees. The cabin was no longer in sight, but I didn't stop to look back. The path seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in tighter, the shadows darker. Finally, I burst out of the woods, back into the open air. I didn't stop until I reached my car, jumping in without hesitation and speeding out of the forest. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The trees were silent again. The whistling was gone. But that's when I saw something I'll never forget. In the reflection of my mirror, there was someone standing by the side of the road. It was the figure, staring at me with hollow eyes, their face still hidden beneath that wide-brimmed hat. They didn't move. They didn't follow me. But I knew they were there, waiting. I didn't stop in Forest Hollow on my way back through. I never went near the Whistling Woods again. And I never told anyone about what happened that day, because I'm afraid that if I do, the whistling will return and whatever's in those woods will come for me. But sometimes when the wind is just right, I still hear it, the whistling. And I know it's not just a sound, it's a warning.
Story number 15.
I moved to Pine Hollow looking for peace. After a messy breakup and a failed career, I needed a fresh start, and a quiet little town was just the escape I thought I needed. Pine Hollow seemed like the perfect place, small, charming, and tucked away in a quiet valley. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and the most exciting thing that happened all year was the Fall Festival. I rented a small cottage on the outskirts of town, surrounded by thick woods. I spent my first few days settling in, enjoying the solitude. The town was everything I wanted, peaceful and undisturbed. But as the days passed, I started to notice something strange about the forest behind my house. There was a tree, an enormous, twisted oak that stood at the edge of the woods. It was different from the others. The trunk was gnarled and hollow, with a dark, almost unnatural hollow at its base. I saw it from my window, and it caught my attention every time I passed by it on my walks. The locals seemed uneasy when I mentioned it. "Don't go near the hollow tree," they'd say. "It's bad luck." But no one ever explained why. Of course, the more they warned me, the more curious I became. What was so special about this tree? There was no explanation, just an air of discomfort whenever anyone brought it up. It was like they were afraid to talk about it too much, as if saying its name out loud would somehow make it real. One evening, just before dusk, I decided to take a walk to the hollow tree. The woods were quiet, almost eerily so. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As I approached the tree, I felt a strange chill in the air, like the temperature had dropped several degrees. The closer I got, the more I could feel something watching me. I stopped in front of the tree and stared at the dark hollow at its base. The hole was big enough for a person to crawl into, but something about it made my skin crawl. I felt drawn to it, as if some invisible force was pulling me closer. I stepped forward, almost without thinking. Then, I heard a voice, a soft whisper, coming from the hollow. "Come closer." I froze. My heart began to race, and every instinct told me to run. But my feet wouldn't move. The whisper continued, growing louder. "You're close now. Just a little farther." I stepped back, panic flooding my chest. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. I turned to run, but before I could, I felt something cold brush against my arm. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Suddenly, the ground beneath me seemed to shift. I stumbled, falling to my knees as I looked back at the tree. The hollow inside it was darker now, as if it was swallowing the last remnants of sunlight. And then, through the blackness, I saw something. Someone. A figure, a woman, her face obscured by long black hair, stood inside the hollow. She was thin, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to bend in strange angles. Her eyes were wide, dark pools, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "I've been waiting for you," the voice said, now much clearer, much closer. I screamed and ran. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could hear her following me, her footsteps too slow to be real, yet somehow getting closer, just behind me in the shadows. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my cottage, slamming the door behind me. The next day, I went to the local diner to try and shake off the night's events. But when I sat down, I noticed the old man sitting at the counter staring at me. He had been there the night I arrived, a fixture of the diner, always watching, always silent. He motioned for me to come over, his weathered face grim. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, unable to speak. "The hollow tree has been here for as long as anyone can remember," he said, looking out the window. "But no one dares to go near it anymore, not since the first one. She came from the tree. She was one of the first settlers here, long before my time. There's a story, but no one talks about it. They say she was cursed, and now her spirit lives inside the tree. She feeds on the living, waiting for someone to get too close." I shuddered. "What happens if you get too close?" The old man looked me dead in the eye. "You'll hear her calling, you'll feel her touch, and when the time comes, she'll pull you into the tree, and you'll never be seen again." I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. That night, the whispering returned. This time, it was louder, closer, like it was coming from inside the walls of my cottage. The same soft, haunting voice calling my name, urging me to come outside. I didn't sleep at all that night. Too afraid to move, too terrified to do anything but listen to the whispers getting louder and louder, as though they were right beside me. I could hear the faint sound of something scratching at the walls, like nails dragging against wood. By morning, I was exhausted, a nervous wreck. I knew I had to leave Pine Hollow. There was no other choice. But as I packed my things, I heard the whispers again, faint but unmistakable. "Just one more step. Come to me." I turned toward the window, and I saw it. The tree. It was standing in the woods, even though I was miles away. Its dark hollow glowed faintly in the distance, and I knew, deep down, that it was calling me again. That was the last time I saw Pine Hollow. I left that morning, and I haven't looked back since. I've heard stories of people who went missing after getting too close to that tree, but none of them were ever found. All that remains is the whisper, carried on the wind, waiting for the next curious soul to step into its grasp. I don't know what happened to the people who vanished, but I do know one thing. If you ever find yourself in Pine Hollow, don't go near the hollow tree, because it's watching. Story the end.